Today I am here to talk about Wooga and the games industry, but rather than talking about the games industry broadly, today I wanted to touch on a couple of the microeconomics of the games industry, at least the way we think about it at Wooga. But first, who is Wooga and where am I coming from? Wooga was founded in 2009 and makes casual games for mobile platforms. And with casual games, I mean puzzle games, casual simulation, and hidden object games. We have 300 employees from more than 40 different countries, all based here in our head office in Berlin. Since 2009, we've had 5 hit games, starting off on Facebook and moving over to mobile, such that in 2015, 70% of our revenues were from mobile platforms. Our latest launches have been Futurama, Game of Drones, which you should definitely download, even if you're not a fan of the show, and Farm Time, which is currently the top game on the Apple Watch. So to the gaming industry. Historically, the gaming industry has obviously been dominated by the console business. And with some of these numbers and the timeframes associated, you can see why. These are very, very large numbers generated in very short periods of time. However, the nature of this is such that for the huge investment that these companies put into building these games, they're reliant on effectively a 3 to 5 day period to generate the vast majority of their return. And you can see this kind of revenue profile is pretty much characteristic of a hit or miss business. However, the gaming industry now is moving increasingly towards mobile. And within mobile, the top 5 games in terms of revenue on both the App Store and Google Play use free-to-play dynamics. What that means is there's no upfront cost for the player, but slowly over time, millions of players make many, many small payments such that we end up with a completely different revenue profile. This kind of revenue is extremely stable over time. Not only is it stable, but it's also sustainable. And 2 of the best examples are here, which unfortunately are not Wooga games, but they're good examples nevertheless. Clash of Clans, launched in 2012, since that time has very rarely moved outside the top 3 games in terms of revenue. Candy Crush, also launched in 2012, very rarely since that time has moved outside the top 5 or 10 games in terms of revenue. Now that's an astounding sustainability of very, very high, stable revenues over time. So what does that mean for us? Now, in the engineering world, games as a service is a concept that's been talked about for a long time. And it's about designing games that players interact with over and over and over again over time. However, it's very rare that that's talked about in terms of revenues or in finance terms. And I would argue that games as a service also applies to our revenue profile. This is an example of a game we launched in 2013. Its 2nd and 3rd year bookings have a very, very small month-on-month variation. And that's not the kind of variation that you would expect from the typical games business. So therefore, Wooga has effectively 2 different assets. The first is the revenue that's stable and sustainable from our live games that we can effectively liken to an annuity. Goodness, that's hard to say, an annuity. The second is obviously our games and development, the area that's funding future growth for us. And that investment in our options for development is what I'd really like to drill down into, because this is the big area of uncertainty. Effectively, when we invest in those options, we can really maximize the value and maximize the payoff of those options because of the dynamics and the methodology we have for developing those games. We start off with very, very small investment in prototyping. Prototyping is a relatively cheap process for us. We then invest slightly more in production. We invest even more to get to our beta launch and to launch it to enough users such that we can test KPIs and the tech behind it. And then obviously the global launch is the most expensive phase. At each of these points, we can choose to either continue to invest in that option or we can withdraw that investment and transfer those learnings to other games, which gives us a huge amount of flexibility in terms of managing the value of those options within our portfolio over time. But how do we value those options? And that comes down to LTV. Now, quite often, people think about LTV as a big unknown. But if we really break that LTV down, actually there are some interesting dynamics behind it. If we look at RPPU, or the average revenue per paying user, this tends to range by genre within a relatively small range. So it's actually relatively easy for us to be able to forecast once we get to the prototyping and soft launch phase. Conversion, the number of players over a month that actually pay to use this game. Again, this is industry benchmarked and has a very, very small range across the industry. And then once we take those two characteristics and we start to look at how much our LTV is going to return over our user acquisition, we start to look at CPI. Now, CPI in the games industry is very much market-driven. And that market, again, comes back to the genre of the game. And as I said, for example, the focus on puzzle games means that CPI, the potential CPI for us, has a relatively small range that it falls into. Hence, even within the prototyping stage, we're able to relatively easily look at exactly what LTV and what kind of return those options may generate for us. Now, once we finally launch those options and we move them into a live game stage, we're in an even better position. Excuse me, because the amount of data we collect around player interaction, player engagement with our game, and the speed of that data means that our feedback loop is incredibly fast. And we can continue to increase the value of that game over time. We can make iterative changes and iterative improvements to increase the value and the payoff from that option that we originally invested in. As such, Wooga is in a very strong place to maximize that potential and to really leverage that sustainability that's inherent to the microeconomics of a games player. We can drive the sustainability by slowly increasing that LTV over time and increasing the value of those annuities, and then we reinvest it back into those options where we can continue to maximize payoff. And as such, the combination from Wooga's live games, as well as the investments we're making in our future games, provide a very, very stable platform for funding tomorrow's hits. I'll leave that with you, and please do enjoy Futurama. Thanks.